The Wyoming sky that autumn was the color of a bruise that wouldn't heal. A woman knelt alone in a canyon passage, her hands already moving before she had finished deciding to stop. A man the size of a barn door lay face down in the dirt. A rock the weight of a wagon wheel pinned his leg. Nobody else had stopped. Nobody else was coming. She didn't know his name. Didn't know what he owned. Didn't know that 3 men in a town 8 miles east were waiting to hear he hadn't made it home. She pulled a dead juniper branch from the canyon wall and found her leverage. The rock moved, and somewhere in Red Rock, a very patient man received the news that something had gone wrong and began quietly to correct it. The man was alive because his fingers were still moving. That was the first thing Rose Calloway saw when she came around the limestone outcropping into the passage. Not the blood in his hair, not the size of him, not the rock pinning his leg, the fingers, clawing at the packed earth in slow, deliberate increments, like a man doing the only thing left available to him and doing it with everything he had. She knelt beside him without touching him yet. The Appaloosa stood 3 feet away, making the sound of an animal that had exhausted its options and was now simply reporting the situation to anyone willing to listen. Rose noted the horse, noted the trailing rein, noted the way the debris was distributed around the rock on his leg. Too clean at the edges, too concentrated in one place. A natural rockfall scattered. This had come from one specific point above and had been encouraged to do so. She put 2 fingers to the side of his neck, fast, thready, but there. She looked at the passage walls. A dead juniper had fallen against the limestone above, and to her left 1 long limb wedged in a crevice at an angle that suggested it had been there long enough to be structural. She worked it free with both hands, tested its flex against the ground, found it solid. She pulled the Appaloosa's loose rein free from the rock it had caught on, and tied it in 2 loops at the base of the branch, where her hands would have grip when her weight was committed elsewhere. She positioned the branch end under the upper edge of the limestone, and found her fulcrum. "I'm moving the rock," she said it to the back of his head because she needed him conscious, and the sound of a voice sometimes held people when nothing else did. When it shifts, you pull forward. Don't think about the pain, just move. She drove her weight down on the branch. The rock shifted. The sound that came from the man beneath it was the sound her father had described once as the body's last line of honesty, the noise that got past every decision a person made about how they were going to behave. She had heard it twice in her father's practice. She did not stop now. She drove harder. Forward. He moved. The rock ground sideways on the packed earth, with the slow resistance of something that had decided it belonged where it was. He dragged himself 2 feet clear. The rock dropped back. The branch snapped. She was already beside him. "Roll over if you can." He could, slowly, and she saw his face for the first time. Mid-40s. Dark hair gone substantially gray at the temples and throughout. The kind of gray that arrived early in men who worked outdoors and worried about things they didn't speak of. The face was broad and built close to the bone. The kind of face that had stopped being young a long time ago and had found something more durable on the other side of it. A cut above his right eye had bled into his hair and dried there. His jaw was set in the manner of a man who had converted pain into structure, not managing it so much as building around it, making it load-bearing rather than incapacitating. His eyes, when they opened, were the precise color of creek water over shale, not warm, not cold. Present, they found her face and held. "Don't take me into town." The voice came stripped of everything optional. "Someone wants me to not make it home." She was already doing the secondary assessment. Right eye tracking correctly, speech clear, breathing shallow and guarded on the left side. She noted the ribs. The left leg would need to come out of the boot before the swelling made that impossible. "Which direction is your ranch?" His eyes shifted slightly. Something moved through them she didn't have the information yet to name. "North. 2 miles. Fork at the cottonwoods, take the left branch. Can you get onto that horse with help?" Yes. He couldn't, quite not without her shoulder under his right arm and her hands managing the distribution of his weight as his body negotiated what it could still do. He was heavy in the specific way of a man whose size came from actual labor across actual years. She felt his breathing alter each time she moved near his left side and filed the information precisely. Getting him into the saddle took time and produced nothing graceful. She guided his right leg over, positioned his left boot clear of the stirrup, waited until his weight was distributed well enough to hold. Then she gathered the rein and began walking north. They didn't speak for the first half-mile. The wind came off the high country from the northwest and pushed the dry grass flat in long, slow pulses across the open ground. The Appaloosa walked beside her without pulling, which she took as information about how the horse had been handled. You didn't ask questions. His voice had found slightly more register than before. Still rationed, still careful. I'll ask them when there's something I can do with the answers. She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. Right now I need to know what I'm treating before you're in a room that has what I need. Asking questions in the canyon wastes the time I need for that. A pause. What do you need? Lamp oil, clean cloth. Strong thread and a fine needle. Whiskey rather than laudanum because the dosage is more predictable and I'll need to control it carefully given the ribs. She looked briefly at the trail and looked back at the ground in front of her. And the boot has to come off that left leg before the swelling closes the option. Another pause. Longer. You a doctor? No. She kept walking. My father was, Esmond Calloway. He practiced medicine in Philadelphia for 30 years. The last patient he treated before he died was himself. And by then there was nothing in his accounts to pay for what might have helped, because he had spent 3 decades making the same calculation every time this family needs the treatment, more than I need, the fee, and the math had come out the way that math always comes out. She said it with the flatness of a fact about terrain, not performance, not bitterness, just the thing that was true and needed to be known. He died in the back room of his own practice. I was 22. I had been working beside him since I was 9. So not a doctor, but in the next 2 miles the closest thing to one you have. He didn't respond to that. She didn't require him to. What's your name? She said it to the trail. One of those pauses that she was already beginning to understand meant he was deciding what to give rather than what to say. Harding. Thomas Harding. She had memorized the name from his letters the way she had memorized everything in them. The straight hand, no flourishes. The economy. The 3 letters instead of 1. The silence that followed was textured differently from the previous ones. You're the woman from Philadelphia. Not quite a question. Rose Calloway. The cottonwood stand was visible ahead, which meant the fork was close. I expect this isn't the introduction either of us planned. No. It isn't mine either. She took the left branch at the fork. Harding Ranch came into view after another quarter mile and required from her exactly 3 seconds of reallocation before she resumed the catalog of what needed doing. She was not a person who stopped for long at anything, but the scale of the place made her revise her working assumptions in ways that had downstream consequences. This was not what a man described as having a working ranch and a working life in 3 letters with no flourishes. The main house was 2 stories of pine and fieldstone, built with the solidity of something designed to outlast everyone who had a hand in it. 3 large structures that read as barn and equipment storage. A cookhouse. A bunkhouse long enough to sleep 20 men with room left over. Fencing that ran east and west as far as the afternoon light allowed her to see. Thomas Harding had not mentioned any of this. She filed it where she filed everything that would matter, and kept walking. The man who came running from the direction of the largest barn was gray-bearded, and moved with the velocity of someone for whom this particular kind of alarm was not unfamiliar, but was never welcome. He caught the Appaloosa's bridle and looked up at Thomas, and his face ran through relief and a more complex response in rapid sequence. Tom. He saw the blood dried into the hair, and whatever else he'd been going to say did not arrive. Get the door. Thomas started to swing down, and Rose put her hand on his arm. Wait until I'm positioned. She moved to his left side. Put your weight on me first. Walt Cannon, she would learn his name was. Walt Cannon watched this with the expression of a man encountering something that did not fit the category he'd prepared for it. Thomas Harding's weight came onto her shoulder, and she walked him inside. The bedroom they settled him in was large and maintained in the way of a space kept up by discipline rather than use. A bed with a dark quilt, a washstand, a window facing east. She pointed at the bed, and he sat on the edge of it without argument, which told her precisely what the pain had reached. Walt appeared in the doorway with clean cloth and a bottle and a lamp before she asked for any of it. She revised her estimate of him upward accordingly. Shirt off. Walt made a sound from the doorway. Thomas looked at her with those creekwater eyes, and something moved in them that lived in the neighborhood of Rye without being it. He began working the buttons with his right hand. She helped with the left side, because his shoulder was not cooperating, and every second spent on it was a second she needed elsewhere. His left ribcage was already developing the deep bruising that announced itself before the swelling did. She pressed in careful increments with 2 fingers, watching his face rather than her hands, because his face was a more honest record of the damage than palpation could be. 3 ribs. Cracked, not displaced. The distinction mattered considerably for the next 2 weeks. They're nicked, not separated. She straightened. If you rest them properly, they'll knit. If you don't, one of them will eventually make the case for why that was a mistake in a way that converts a 2-week problem into 6. She held his gaze to make sure the number landed where she intended it. The leg now. The boot is the problem. Do it. Walt held the leg steady while she worked the boot off in careful increments. She watched Thomas's face throughout because his face was telling her the location and intensity of the damage faster and more accurately than the leg itself. He went pale twice. He made no sound either time. The ankle beneath was badly swollen and purpling along the outer edge. She rotated it in measured degrees and noted precisely where his jaw tightened. Badly sprained. Possible small fracture at the outer bone, but the treatment is the same either way. She began wrapping with the cloth. Walt had ready. Methodical. Tight enough to matter. 2 weeks of not walking on it beyond necessity. After that we reassess. Walt produced a whiskey bottle from somewhere with the timing of a man who had learned to anticipate. She took it. 2 swallows before I start on the shoulder. She met Thomas's eyes. The ribs are going to make the next several minutes expensive. This won't eliminate the cost, but it moves the edges back. He took the bottle. Drank, returned it without looking away from her face, which she noted as information about the kind of attention he paid to things. She threaded the needle. He managed his breathing with the concentration of a man who understood that the ribs were looking for any excuse to spike and had decided not to give them one. 12 stitches. She tied the last one and set the needle in the basin and sat back on the edge of the washstand. Walt had stepped out somewhere in the middle of it. The room was quiet in the particular way of a space where something difficult had just been completed, and the air hadn't yet decided what to do with itself. Thomas was looking at the ceiling. His breathing had settled into something more sustainable, the whiskey doing its measured work at the margins of him. She did things like that. His voice had found the register below his ordinary one, the one where the performance of a certain kind of self fell away, and what was left was something close to the actual material. Didn't explain the approach. Saw what needed doing and moved. I'd find out what she'd decided after it was already done. Rose set down the basin cloth. Looked at her hands. She did not ask. She had learned this from her father, who said that a question in the wrong moment was a door slammed on something that had been deciding whether to come through. Margaret. A breath, not a pause. A breath that was also a boundary being crossed. My wife, 8 years gone. He was still looking at the ceiling, which she understood was not avoidance but positioning. Some things were easier to say to a fixed neutral point. She knew what mattered. She moved toward it. She didn't make a production of either of those things. That sounds like someone who understood what time actually cost. She kept her voice level and undecorated. The decorated version of sympathy, the careful wrapping and softening, was the thing she had been most impatient with in the weeks after her father died. All those cushioned voices. All that insulation around the fact of the thing. Thomas didn't respond to that directly. He went quiet in a way that was not the absence of something but the presence of it, held still. She let it be what it was and continued cleaning the washstand. She didn't notice him cross into sleep. She noticed, at some point, while she was wringing out the last cloth, that his breathing had changed to the slower pattern, and that his jaw had finally released its structural decision. Whatever had been holding everything at the surface had let go. She stood. Looked at the window where the light was going, the way Wyoming light went without the gradual she had been trained to expect by a city that considered abruptness impolite. Then she went to find Walt Cannon. He was in the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee already poured. She wrapped both hands around hers. The coffee was strong enough to be considered a building material, and she was grateful for it. He told her about Grant Dillard. He told her in the way of a man delivering terrain information rather than a narrative. Here is the ground, here is what it will do to you, here is what has already happened to others on it. 3 years of patient acquisition around the perimeter of Harding Range. Small homesteads, families who had hit a bad season and needed the cash more than the land, Each sail individually explainable and collectively a picture that only resolved into its true shape from a distance. 6 weeks ago, Dillard had come to Thomas with an offer to purchase the ranch. The number Walt described without specifying as an insult expressed in the language of commerce. Thomas had declined without discussion. Then the fence cuts on the south pasture. Then the blocked water diversion on the North Creek, twice, the same location both times. Then 2 days ago, Thomas had ridden back from a county commissioner meeting on the back road through the canyon. Someone had known he would take that road. Someone who knew the ranch's rhythms, and the route and the specific geography of the canyon, well enough to know where a particular rock could be made to fall. Did he report it? Rose drank her coffee and watched Walt's face. Walt looked at his cup. Sheriff Taggart has been operating out of Dillard's pocket since before the bank opened. County Commissioner carries a loan with First Territorial he's 6 months in arrears on. He set his cup down. There's no legal mechanism in Red Rock right now that Dillard doesn't own an interest in. She thought about this. About a man who had spent 3 years building a trap around someone who didn't know they were standing in it. About the specific character of that kind of patience. Not the patience of someone waiting for an opportunity, but the patience of someone manufacturing one, incrementally, with the confidence of a person who had never been seriously opposed. What does Dillard want with the ranch? She kept her voice even. Specifically. Not the general shape of it, what is the specific thing? Walt looked at her with the expression of a man deciding how much was hers to know. Then he decided. I don't know the full of it, but I know that 6 months ago a survey crew came through this basin claiming to be mapping railroad routes. Tom didn't think much of it. The railroad has sent crews through before. He paused, but those men weren't working for the railroad. I found out later they came out of Denver, private company, and their results were never filed with any railroad I can find record of. She was quiet for a moment. They were filed somewhere. That's what I believe. She looked at her coffee cup, and then at the window, over the dry sink, where the last of the daylight was making its exit, and thought about what a private geological survey in this basin might be looking for, and what it might have found, and what a man like Dillard would do with that information once he had it. Doc Reed. She set down her cup. Walt told me Thomas said not to bring him in, but you mentioned him when you were explaining who Thomas trusts. What does Doc Reed know about this valley specifically? Walt's expression shifted in a way that was small but significant. Sam Reed has been practicing medicine in Red Rock for 30 years. He was here before the railroad came through, before Dillard's bank opened. He chose the next words with visible care. He was here in 1858 when Tom's father first acquired the land that became this ranch. He treated the men who did the clearing. He kept records of everything. He always has. Is he the kind of man whose records would matter to Dillard? If Dillard is running a legal play against the original acquisition, which is what I think the forged documentation I heard about from the county recorder's office is pointing toward, then, yes. Sam Reed is the only living person whose contemporaneous records from that year could directly contradict whatever story Dillard has constructed. Walt was quiet for a moment. Sam lives alone above his practice. Has for 20 years. Rose absorbed this and did not like what it assembled into. And on this property, she kept her voice level. Is there anyone Dillard could be using? Walt's face did something complicated. He turned his coffee cup in his hands and looked at the table. Pete Garner. Good cowboy, East Section, been here 16 years. His brother Ray has a small place about 20 miles out. Bought it 3 years ago with a loan from First Territorial. He stopped at the natural stopping point where the implication completed itself without needing to be spoken. She nodded once and left it where it was. She refilled her cup and went back down the hall to Thomas's room and sat in the chair by the washstand, not the window. The washstand, because she had already decided that the window was not where she was going to be when she needed to think, and looked at the man sleeping in the low lamplight and thought about Dillard. The specific danger of a patient man with resources was not cruelty. Cruel men moved too fast and made the mistakes that fast movement generated. The danger was architecture. 3 years of building something that looked, from any single vantage point, like ordinary commerce. Fence cuts that could be weather. Water blockages that could be debris. A survey crew that could be railroad planning. Each piece individually explainable, collectively a machine. The machine needed 2 more things to complete itself. It needed Thomas's legal title to be undermined, which the forged documentation was designed to accomplish. And it needed the one person who could contradict that documentation to be unavailable. Doc Reed. She was still thinking through the shape of this when Thomas shifted in the bed, and his breathing changed and she knew he was back. You're still here. Rough. Clearer than before. Your temperature needed monitoring. She didn't look away from the middle distance she'd been working in. Infections in shoulder wounds run fast. I needed to be close enough to catch it early. A pause. Is there an infection? Not yet. Which is the outcome I was here to produce. She looked at him then. His color was better. The pain was still structural in his face, but no longer the whole architecture of it. How much do you know about what Dillard is doing? He looked at the ceiling. More than I did a week ago. Less than I need to. Walt told me about the survey crew. She kept her voice even. Private company out of Denver, results not filed with any railroad. What do you think they were surveying for? A long pause. The kind that wasn't deciding what to say, but deciding whether to say it. There have been silver strikes in this basin before. North of here, mostly. Nothing conclusive on my land as far as anyone has told me. He paused. But if someone had information that contradicted that, they would know the land was worth considerably more than its surface value. Rose held his gaze. And they would know that the fastest way to acquire it would be to undermine the title rather than negotiate the price. Thomas looked at her for a moment. The Creekwater eyes with that quality of attention that didn't allocate itself provisionally. Walt told you that much. Walt told me about the survey. I told myself the rest. She stood and checked the lamp wick and sat back down. Tomorrow I'm going to Red Rock. You don't know Red Rock. I know where Ned Finch's office is. Walt told me. And I know that a man who has spent 4 years building documentations to someone like Dillard has already decided what he's going to do with it. He's been waiting for the circumstances that make it usable. She met his eyes directly. I want to know if we're those circumstances. Thomas was quiet. His hands lay flat on the quilt. Finch is careful. His voice had that character of a man who had known the person he was describing for a long time. He doesn't open that file for strangers. Then I'll need to become someone he decides isn't a stranger. She picked up the lamp from the washstand and adjusted it. You should sleep again. The ribs will be worse in the morning, when the initial response settles and the real inflammation begins. I need you to have slept before that happens. He looked at her with those eyes for a moment that had things moving through it she could identify components of, but didn't attempt to catalog in full. You came here to get married. He said it with something careful underneath it. Not accusation, something else. I came here because it was the decision that made sense given what was true. She stood. I stay somewhere for the same reason. Right now the reasons are accumulating rather than thinning. She moved toward the door and stopped. Don't move the shoulder tonight if you can manage it. The stitches will hold, but they'd prefer not to be tested before morning. She went out. In the hallway she stood still for a moment with the lamp turned low. The house had sounds. She was beginning to sort the particular tick of the stovepipe contracting, the wind finding a specific gap in the eaves on the north side, the creak of a floor joist that ran under the weight of a person moving somewhere in the bunkhouse. She was building the vocabulary of the place. Her father had told her that understanding a space was the prerequisite for operating effectively inside it. You had to know what the normal sounds were before you could identify the abnormal ones. She thought about his hands, not in general specifically. The way the left one had a slight tremor in the last year that he compensated for by bracing his wrist against the edge of the examination table before he began. The way he had adapted without discussing it, without asking for accommodation, because discussing it would have made it a problem rather than a fact to be worked around. She had watched him do this for a year before he knew she had noticed. She thought about a sentence in Thomas Harding's third letter, crossed out so thoroughly that the pen had nearly perforated the paper. She had held it up to the window light in the empty apartment, with the furniture already sold, and made out the shape of the words underneath. Not all of them. Enough. I don't want someone who will manage this place. The rest had been taken past recovery. She had not thought too hard about it then. She was practical. She would find out when she got there. She was finding out. She went to the kitchen and built the fire back up for the morning, and checked the stove and stood at the table, not the window, and finished thinking through what needed to happen in Red Rock tomorrow. and in what sequence, and what she would need from Finch and Todin, and what she would need to have confirmed what she suspected about the silver. What she suspected about the silver, and about what Dillard was actually building toward. One thing at a time. Her father had said this in the context of a crowded emergency, and she had applied it to everything since. The principle held. It always held. She was at the table, not thinking about the window, when she heard it. Hoofbeats. Moving away from the property rather than toward it. Moving slowly and carefully, the particular pace of someone who did not want the departure to announce itself. Moving south. South was the road to Red Rock. She went to the back door and opened it into the cold Wyoming night and listened. Nothing visible. Total dark, the cloud cover complete. But the sound was there, rhythmic, fading, moving away along the south pasture fence line toward the road. She went to the front of the house, where Walt had fallen asleep at the kitchen table, with his arms folded and his head down, which she considered entirely reasonable given the day he'd had. She put her hand on his shoulder. He came awake fast and clean, the way her father had described combat veterans coming awake not from sleep but from readiness suspended. Someone just left this property on horseback. She kept her voice low. Moving south toward Red Rock, moving quiet on purpose. Walt looked at her, then at the dark window, then at something that was not the window but was in the direction of the bunkhouse. He didn't say anything. She waited. Pete Garner's bunk would be the one to check. He said it the way he'd said Pete's name earlier, with the care of a man setting something down that he didn't want to break. She nodded. Can it wait until morning? Walt thought about this for what felt like a genuine amount of time. If Pete rode to Red Rock tonight and told Dillard what he knows, the damage is done whether we confront him now or at dawn. He looked at the table, and what Pete knows is Tom's schedule, the route to the canyon, the general timing of his meetings. He paused. He doesn't know you're here. He doesn't know what you've figured out. He doesn't know I've been talking to Finch. Then the damage is bounded. She pulled out the other chair and sat. Let it sit until morning. If Pete comes back, we know what kind of man he is when the bad decision becomes real. If he doesn't come back, we know something else. Walt looked at her across the table.
You're not from here, no.
Tom usually figures things from the front, straight at them. I know. She looked at her hands on the table. That's a quality that built this ranch. It's also the quality Dillard has been designing around for 3 years. She looked up. Tomorrow I go to Red Rock and talk to Finch. Tonight we know what we know and we sleep, and we let Pete Garner make whatever choice he's going to make. Walt was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who had decided to trust something he didn't fully have a name for yet. She went back down the hall to Thomas's room and set the lamp on the washstand and sat in the chair and looked at the man sleeping in it with his jaw unclenched. For what she suspected was the first time in longer than the last several hours. She thought about the survey crew from Denver. About silver under the ground that a man had been standing on for 20 years without knowing. About the specific cruelty of a plan that used a man's own land against him while he was occupied with building what was on top of it. About forged documentation in a distant county courthouse, and a physician who kept records of everything and lived alone above his practice. She thought about what needed to happen tomorrow in what order, and with what available to her, and what she would need to build between now and then. Outside, Wyoming night pressed down on the sagebrush and the miles of fence and the road south, where someone was riding quiet toward a man who had been patient for 3 years. Because patient men played longer games than anyone gave them credit for. And Rose Calloway sat in a chair in a stranger's house in a territory she had arrived in 12 hours ago, and was, she realized, more awake and more present than she had been in the 3 years, since she had sat in a different chair in a different room, and held her father's hands while they went still. She had come to Wyoming because the math worked out, because the decision made sense. Because a man had written 3 letters when one would have done, and crossed out a sentence until the paper nearly gave way. She was going to find out what the rest of that sentence said. But first, tomorrow, Finch, Doc Reed, the shape of what Dillard was building and where the structure was weakest. One thing at a time. She was her father's daughter. She knew how to be patient too. She did not sleep. Not because she couldn't, because the house made sounds she hadn't catalogued yet. And she needed to know which sounds were the house settling, and which sounds were something else. And the only way to know the difference was to stay awake long enough to learn the vocabulary of the place. Her father had told her once that every building had a language, and the first thing you did in any new space was listen before you spoke. She listened until the gray before dawn started pressing at the east window. Then she checked Thomas's breathing, found it even and deep, and went to the kitchen to rebuild the fire in the stove. Walt was already there. He'd slept in his chair for maybe 3 hours by the look of him, which she estimated was more than she'd gotten and less than he needed. He had the coffee pot on before she reached the stove, and he moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of a man who had been doing the same tasks in the same space for long enough that his body did them without consulting him. They didn't speak for several minutes. The fire caught. The coffee started working on itself. Outside, the Wyoming dark was thinning at the edges into something the color of a bruise, purple-gray and tentative, the light not yet committed to arriving. Walt set a cup in front of her. She wrapped both hands around it. Pete Garner. She kept her voice low, not because anyone was nearby, because some conversations required that register regardless. When does he usually start his day? Before light. He'd be out to the east pasture by now. Walt drank his coffee and looked at the window, or he wouldn't be here at all. She had considered that. The man who rode south in the dark had 2 choices available to him by morning: come back and pretend nothing had happened, or don't come back and let the absence say everything. The first choice required a particular kind of nerve. The second required the conclusion that the absence was survivable. Let it sit for now. She set her cup down. If he comes back, we know what kind of man he is under pressure. If he doesn't, we know something else. She looked at Walt directly. What I need from you this morning is Ned Finch. Walt's expression shifted by a degree she was learning to read. Something between acknowledgement and relief. He'll be in his office by gets there early, leaves late, doesn't vary. Does Dillard watch his office? Dillard watches everything in Red Rock. But Finch has clients across the territory. People visit him all the time. A woman walking in would be less notable than most. She nodded. I'll need a horse that knows its business. The roan in the 3rd stall. She's steady. Good. She picked up her cup again. And someone needs to sit with Thomas until I'm back. He's going to try to get up before he should, and the argument you make to him needs to be specific. Tell him that if a fractured rib moves incorrectly, he won't be sitting a horse for 6 weeks instead of 2. That's the number that will land. Something shifted at the corner of Walt's mouth that in another man and another moment might have resolved into a smile. It didn't quite get there. You've known him 12 hours. I've known men who decide to ignore pain their whole lives. They all speak the same language. She finished her coffee. The number that matters is the one tied to what they can't afford to lose. She went to check on Thomas before she left. He was awake. She knew he was awake before she reached the door, because his breathing had that particular quality of someone maintaining the rhythm of sleep on purpose rather than naturally. And when she pushed the door open, he gave up the pretense and opened his eyes. You're going into Red Rock. Not a question. Finch first. Then I'll know what else we need. He watched her from the bed with that same attentiveness she'd seen in the canyon, the kind that didn't allocate itself provisionally. You don't know Red Rock. I don't need to know Red Rock. I need to know one office in it. She stepped to the washstand and checked the shoulder bandaging without asking permission. The bleeding had stayed stopped. The skin around the stitches was warm, but not the wrong kind of warm. Finch has been building a file on Dillard for 4 years. Walt told me that last night. A man who spends 4 years building a file on someone is a man who has already decided what he's going to do with it. He's been waiting for the right circumstances to use it. I want to know if we're those circumstances. Thomas looked at the ceiling. His jaw had that set quality again, the one that meant he was managing something internal that he'd decided not to give voice to. Finch is careful. He won't talk to someone he doesn't know. Then I'll have to become someone he decides to know. She finished the check and straightened. Don't get up. The number Walt's going to give you is 6 weeks and it's accurate. She left before he could respond to that, which she understood was becoming a pattern, and decided was a reasonable one given the current pace of events. The roan was exactly what Walt had said. Steady and direct, no wasted movement. The kind of horse that had been well handled early and remembered it. Rose rode astride rather than side saddle, which she had learned in Philadelphia from a woman who ran a livery stable on the south side and had considered side saddle a form of institutional dishonesty. The Wyoming terrain confirmed this view. There was nothing about the road to Red Rock that suggested compromise was a viable option. She reached the edge of town as the morning was committing itself to existence. Red Rock was modest in the way of a place that had arrived at its current size through function rather than ambition. A main street wide enough for wagons to pass without negotiation. A bank that was the largest building by deliberate design. A hotel. 2 saloons set at opposite ends of the street as if to discourage conversation between their respective clienteles. A general store with a porch. A church. And set back slightly from the main street with a door that had a painted wooden sign beside it reading at Finch, Notary and Counsel. A narrow building that looked like it had been squeezed into its lot as an afterthought, and had decided to make the best of the situation. She tied the roan at the post and went in. The office was small and organized in the way of a space where a precise mind had been working in close quarters for a long time. Papers in specific locations. Books shelved by some system that wasn't immediately apparent but clearly existed. A desk that was occupied by a man who was perhaps 60, thin in the way of someone whose thoughts burned most of his available fuel, with eyes that moved over Rose when she came through the door, in a single practiced assessment that logged her age, her clothing, her posture, her bag, and whatever conclusions they generated. Miss. His voice was dry and measured. Can I help you? I need 20 minutes of your time. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without being invited, which she understood was a choice that communicated something and had made it deliberately. I'm Rose Calloway. I arrived in Red Rock territory yesterday. I'm going to be Thomas Harding's wife. And I need to understand the shape of what Grant Dillard is doing before it moves past the point where understanding it is enough. Ned Finch looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had been expecting a particular kind of morning and had just been handed a different one. Thomas Harding sent you. Thomas Harding is in bed with 3 fractured ribs and a leg he can't put weight on, because someone arranged for a rock to come off a canyon wall onto him yesterday. She held his eyes. He didn't send me. Nobody sends me. I came because I'm the only person in the current situation who can walk into this office without Dillard noticing and thinking about what it means. Finch set down his pen. He looked at her the way he'd look at a document that required more careful reading than the first pass suggested. You're from Philadelphia. Yes, Edmund Calloway's daughter. She went still. Not visibly, but still. You knew my father. Knew of him. His reputation came ahead of him in certain medical circles. A physician who treated people without the ability to pay. Finch picked up his pen again and set it down in a different position. I was sorry to hear he died. The kind of man who does what he believed regardless of what it costs him is a specific and diminishing category. She said nothing, let the silence be what it was, and waited for him to decide what came next. He opened his bottom desk drawer, pulled out a folder that was thick enough to have required years of deliberate accumulation, set it on the desk between them. What do you know about silver? His voice had shifted into something more direct, the social register gone. She looked at the folder. Tell me, he told her. He laid it out with the precision of a man who had been rehearsing the presentation in his mind for long enough that it had achieved its final form. Grant Dillard had employed a surveying company out of Denver 18 months ago to conduct a geological assessment of the Powder River Basin under the cover of railroad route planning. The survey results had never been filed with the railroad. They had been filed instead with Dillard personally, delivered to his private residence rather than the bank, and Finch knew this because the surveyor's assistant, a young man who understood the significance of what he was being asked to keep quiet, had eventually become uncomfortable enough with the arrangement to speak to someone he trusted. That someone had been Finch. The survey indicated a silver deposit of significant extent beneath the western portion of Harding Ranch. Not a small vein, a deposit of the kind that, properly extracted, represented a number so large that Dillard had apparently decided it justified whatever methods were necessary to acquire the land above it before Thomas Harding found out what he was standing on. Rose sat with this for a moment, not because it surprised her in its nature, but because its scale required adjustment. He doesn't know. She wasn't asking. As of 3 days ago, when I last had reliable information on the question, Thomas Harding has no knowledge of any mineral survey conducted on his property. Finch closed the folder without offering her a look inside it. He bought that land with his hands. He spent 20 years building what's on top of it. Dillard has spent the last 3 years very quietly making sure that when he finally moves, he moves through legal mechanisms that make the whole thing look like business. The forged documentation about the original land purchase. Finch nodded once. Filed 6 months ago in a county office 2 territories over. A claim that a portion of the original Harding acquisition in 1858 was transacted with funds derived from a cattle operation, subsequently found to have engaged in illegal activity. The man named in the documentation has been dead for 11 years. The records it references existed until approximately 4 years ago, when the relevant county courthouse suffered a fire. He paused. A fire that the insurance assessment at the time attributed to faulty chimney construction. She looked at him. You know it wasn't. I know that 3 months before that fire, Dillard extended a significant personal loan to the county recorder of that jurisdiction, and that the loan was marked paid in full 30 days after the fire, with no record of payment received at the bank. Rose was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about patient men, about the specific danger of someone who was willing to spend a decade building a trap around someone who didn't know they were standing in it. Doc Reed. Finch's expression changed in a way that was small but significant. Samuel Reed was practicing medicine in this valley in 1858. He treated injuries resulting from the original land clearing on the Harding property. He kept records. He paused. He keeps all his records. Has since the beginning. He is the only living person whose contemporaneous documentation could directly contradict the forged claim. Where is he? She kept her voice level. Not where he's supposed to be. Where he actually is right now. Finch looked at her for 3 full seconds. His practice was found unoccupied this morning when his first patient arrived at 7. The door was unlocked. The lamp had burned out. His coat was on its hook. The room was very quiet. A man doesn't leave for somewhere in a hurry and leave his coat. She stood. Dillard has him. He's being held somewhere close because transporting someone Doc Reed's age across difficult terrain creates risk, and Dillard doesn't take risks he doesn't have to. She looked at Finch. What property does Dillard hold outside the bank building? Under his name or any company name you have documentation on. Finch was already moving to his filing cabinet. He pulled a second folder, thinner than the first, and opened it on the desk. 3 properties. A warehouse at the north edge of town currently leased to a grain merchant. A residential property on the East Road, occupied by a family who had been renting it for 2 years. And a relay station 5 miles west of Red Rock on the old freight road, decommissioned when the main road shifted 8 years ago, listed in county records as unoccupied and scheduled for tax assessment. She looked at the relay station entry. When was the last time anyone had reason to check on it? The tax assessment is 18 months overdue. Finch looked at her across the desk. Miss Calloway, Mrs. Harding. She said it without emphasis, not a correction, just accurate. He held her gaze for a moment. Mrs. Harding, what you're considering is not a course of action I can officially advise. I'm not asking for advice. She picked up her bag. I'm asking whether you have a lien record that would give a legal representative reason to inspect that property without prior notification to the listed owner. Finch looked at the folder. Back at her. An overdue tax assessment generates an automatic right of inspection for county purposes. He paused. I am authorized to conduct such inspections as notary of record for this district. Then I suggest you find that authorization document. She moved toward the door. I'll meet you at the west end of the main street in 30 minutes. Come alone and don't tell anyone where you're going. She stopped at the door. And bring whatever you need to take. A formal written statement from a 68-year-old physician who has been waiting 8 years to tell the truth about something. She went out before he could respond to that. The 30 minutes she spent not wasting. She found the general store, purchased additional bandaging cloth and a second bottle of carbolic solution because what she was about to do might generate the need for both, and she stood at the counter and thought about the relay station and what she knew about how men like Dillard used spaces like that. He would have people there. Not many, enough. The value of a person being held as leverage was that they stayed alive and usable, which meant whoever was watching Doc Reed had instructions to maintain rather than harm. That was the only advantage she had going in, and she intended to use it completely. She thought about the Derringer in her bag. 2 shots. She had carried it since the night a man had attempted to take her father's medical bag from her on a Philadelphia street 3 years ago. She had not had to use it then, having discovered that the presentation of it was sufficient. She understood that Wyoming was a different calibration of that equation, but held to the underlying principle. Most men who did violence on behalf of other men preferred to avoid situations that generated complications. And a complication was anything that made the arrangement they were being paid for more difficult than the money justified. She was going to try to be a complication. Finch was at the west end of the street in 28 minutes, which told her something useful about his character. He was on a bay horse and had a leather satchel across his saddle. He sat the horse with the ease of a man who had spent more years outdoors than his office suggested, and she revised her assessment of him accordingly. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had made a decision and was committed to it now regardless of his reservations. They rode west without speaking. The freight road was overgrown at the edges, but the center was still packed from years of wagon traffic, and the horses moved well on it. The morning had made up its mind and was now fully present, cold and bright, the kind of Wyoming day where the air felt like it had been laundered. The relay station was a low building, squared timber, with a small corral to the east side that was missing 3 fence rails. She saw 2 horses in the corral before the building resolved clearly enough to see anything else. 2 horses meant at minimum 2 people. She stopped a quarter-mile back and looked. Finch stopped beside her. "If I go in first." She kept her eyes on the building, from the front, asking for directions. "Lost on the freight road, looking for the Coldwater Creek crossing. And if they don't receive that well, then I'll need you to come through the back." She looked at him. "There's a window on the east side of those buildings." Standard construction of this type always put a window on the eastern exposure for morning light. "If you hear anything that sounds like a problem, come through it." Finch looked at the building, looked at his satchel. "I'm a notary, Mrs. Harding. You're a man with a legal document giving you right of inspection and presumably can mean some use of defending yourself, given that you've spent 4 years building a case against someone with the resources and temperament Dillard has." She looked at him directly. "Are you armed?" A pause. "Yes, good." She turned the roan toward the station. "Give me 5 minutes before you move." She rode in directly, not cautiously. Caution in an approach communicated awareness of something to be cautious about, and she needed to communicate the opposite. She rode up to the station door at an ordinary pace, and swung down and tied the roan at the post that was still standing outside, and knocked on the door with the matter-of-fact firmness of someone who had a reasonable purpose and expected it to be recognized as such. The door opened. The man who opened it was broad and unshaven, and had the look of someone doing a job he'd been told required patience and who was beginning to find patience expensive. He looked at her in the way men looked at a woman in an unexpected location, a look that ran through a series of categories before settling on an assessment. "Help you." Flat and uninviting. "I'm looking for the Coldwater Creek crossing." She let the Philadelphia accent stay in her voice. Let it be the whole story. A woman from elsewhere, clearly out of her element, clearly not a threat. "I was told to stay on the freight road, but I think I've gone past the turnoff. I'm expected at the Harding Ranch by noon." The mention of the ranch name did something small in his eyes. She watched it happen and filed it away and kept her expression at the same level of mild inconvenience. "Road doubles back east, 3 miles. He started to close the door. "I'm sorry, I wonder if I might trouble you for some water. My canteen ran dry and I've been riding since before light." She gestured toward the roan. "I'd be very grateful." He looked at her, looked at the horse. The calculation ran in his eyes. A woman asking for water was a minor inconvenience. Refusing a woman asking for water was a choice with a particular social weight to it, in a territory where women were still rare enough to be treated with something resembling consideration. He stepped back from the door. Not an invitation. A grudging concession. She went in. The station was one large room divided by function rather than walls. A table with 2 chairs, both occupied by what was on them rather than people. Gear. Saddlebags. A rifle leaned against the near wall. Through the back of the room, a door that was closed. And from behind that door, nothing she could hear over the ambient noise of the room, but a quality of absence that was itself a kind of sound. Someone had been told to stay quiet, or couldn't make noise. She went to the near wall where a bucket and ladle sat on a wooden shelf and filled her canteen with deliberate slowness, making conversation as she did it. Nothing important. The weather. The road. The way the frost had come early this year, according to the driver on the coach from Laramie. She let the conversation be light and unremarkable, and she let her eyes do the actual work, tracking the closed door, tracking the distance to the rifle, tracking the single other person she could now confirm was in the room, seated at the table, eating something that didn't warrant looking up from. 2 men, 1 closed door, 12 feet between her and the rifle. She capped her canteen and turned and let something shift in her expression. Not alarm, calculation made visible. The look of someone who has just understood something they hadn't walked in knowing. I think I should tell you something. She kept her voice steady and direct and looked at the man who had opened the door. My name is Rose Calloway. I'm going to be Thomas Harding's wife. And the man behind that door is someone I have reason to believe you are holding without legal authority. She reached into her bag without hurrying and set the derringer on the shelf beside the bucket in a position that required her to pick it up with deliberate intention rather than urgency, which made it simultaneously present and non-threatening. I'm not here to cause problems for you personally. The man who told you to do this job did not tell you the full nature of what you were getting involved in. But I suspect you already know that, because men who know the full nature of things don't take jobs like this one. The man who had opened the door looked at the derringer, looked at her, his jaw worked. The man at the table had stopped eating. There is a county notary outside with a right of inspection document. She kept her voice at the same register, even, informational. He is going to come through that east window in approximately 2 minutes, whether or not this conversation has resolved itself. Because I told him to, and he is a man who does what he says he will do. She looked at the first man steadily. What happens in the next 2 minutes is going to determine what the next several months of your life look like. I'd like to suggest that they don't have to look like a cell in the Cheyenne Territorial Prison. The man at the table stood up. She picked up the derringer, not pointing it, just holding it. The distinction was precise and intentional, and she watched both men register it. I'm going to open that door. She said it the way she said everything that mattered, like a statement of what was already true rather than what she intended to make true. You can make that easier or more complicated. Those are the options. The first man looked at the second man. Something passed between them that was the entire silent conversation of 2 people who were being paid not enough to have made a different decision when they had the chance. The first man stepped aside. She crossed the room and opened the door. Doc Samuel Reed was sitting on the floor against the far wall, with his wrists tied in front of him and his coat missing, which was the detail that landed with the most weight. Because she'd been told his coat was on its hook at the practice. And it turned out whoever had taken him in a hurry had not given him the consideration of taking it along. He was 68 years old and he had been on this floor through a cold Wyoming night in his shirt sleeves. But his eyes when they came up to find her face were entirely clear. You're not anyone I know. His voice was rough with cold and dry with the dehydration of a night without water. But the mind behind the eyes was a physician's mind, and it was cataloging her even now from the floor, with his hands tied. Rose Calloway. She was already kneeling and working the knots, which were competent but not expert, done by someone who knew the basic shape of restraint without a refined practice of it. Thomas Harding's wife. I'm going to get you out of here, and then I'm going to need you to sit with a notary for about an hour, and tell him everything you know about Dillard's claim on the 1,858 land acquisition. He watched her hands on the rope. Thomas is all right. He's going to be all right. He's at the ranch. He'll be better when we're back. The rope gave. He brought his hands to his chest, and she watched him assess the circulation damage, which was the thing a physician did before anything else because the hands were where you needed to start. There's something else. His voice had dropped, not from weakness, from the register of something that had been waiting a long time to be said and had decided this was the moment regardless of the circumstances. Something about Thomas, about Margaret. She helped him to his feet. He was unsteady in the specific way of someone who had been stationary too long rather than physically harmed, the balance recalibrating itself. She kept her hand on his arm. I know. She steered him toward the door. Walt told me you knew Margaret, that you were her physician. Walt doesn't know what I know. He steadied. His eyes found hers with the directness of a man making a decision he'd been postponing for 8 years. What I know, Thomas needs to hear, and I should have told him a long time ago. She looked at him. Can it wait until we're out of this building? A pause, then something that was almost a smile. I've waited 8 years, Mrs. Harding. I expect another hour won't break anything. Finch came through the east window at that moment, which was an entrance that had less dignity than he probably preferred, and landed in the back room, with the satchel and his right hand free, and the expression of a man who had committed to a course of action and was seeing it through regardless of his feelings about windows. He looked at Doc Reed. He looked at Rose. He looked at the two men who were standing in the outer room with the particular posture of people who had decided that the job had exceeded its terms. Ned Finch. He straightened his coat. Notary of record, Powder River District. I am Extension under the Tax Assessment Authority. He opened his satchel and produced a document with the precision of a man who had been preparing for this specific moment, for long enough that the preparation had achieved its final form. I'm going to need to speak with these two gentlemen about what they know regarding the instruction they received and who gave it to them. Rose left him to that. She took Doc Reed outside into the cold, bright air, and the roan turned her head and regarded them both with the patient interest of a horse that had been waiting for the situation to resolve. She helped him onto Finch's bay, which was the more placid of the two animals and better suited for a man recovering his equilibrium. Doc Reed sat in the saddle and looked at the sky for a moment with the expression of someone taking inventory of what was still intact. He's going to be angry that you did this. He meant Thomas. He's going to try to make it look like anger. She untied the roan. It's going to be something else, and we're both going to pretend we don't notice. Doc Reed looked at her with those clear physician's eyes. You've known him less than 24 hours. I know the type. She swung up onto the roan. I grew up watching my father be the same kind of man. Anger is easier to carry than the other thing, and he's been carrying the other thing for 8 years. Doc Reed was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had content in it. He blamed himself. His voice had dropped again to that register of something long held, for not being there. When Margaret died, he was in the next county protecting 11 families from losing their land in a legal proceeding that would have taken everything from them. Margaret knew he was going to leave the minute he heard. She made me promise not to send word. He looked at the road ahead, rather than at Rose. She said, he has to finish what he started or it will eat him up regardless of what happens to me. She said, Sam, I am a physician's wife and I know the difference between what I'm afraid of and what is actually going to happen. Rose kept the roan steady, and what actually happened? The fever came faster than either of us expected. His voice was level. The levelness of someone who had said this in their mind so many times it had worn smooth. She went in a night. By the time I could have gotten word to him, and he could have come, it would have been after. She was right about the timing, and she was wrong about how long it would take, and I have lived with both of those facts every day for 8 years. The road ran east toward Red Rock, bright and cold, the frost still on the grass at the margins. Rose thought about Thomas in that bed with his jaw unclenched for the first time in what she was now understanding was a very long time. She thought about a man who had been carrying the weight of an absence he believed was a choice rather than a circumstance. She thought about what it did to a person to carry something like that, the specific way it changed the shape of everything that came after. She thought about her father's hands, how they went still when he was thinking through something difficult. How they looked when they finally set something down. He needs to hear it from you. She kept her eyes on the road. Not from Walt, not from me, from you. I know. Doc Reed rode in silence for a moment. I should have told him at the time. I knew that then and I knew it the next year and I knew it every year after that. The longer you carry something you should have said, the heavier it gets. And the heavier it gets, the harder it is to put down. Because by then you're so accustomed to the weight you've forgotten you're carrying it. The road made a curve east. In the distance, Red Rock was visible as a collection of shapes against the mid-morning sky. She thought about that, about the specific accuracy of it, about the things people carried, because putting them down required saying them out loud, and saying them out loud required a moment and a person and a set of circumstances that never quite arranged themselves. She thought about a sentence in a letter crossed out so hard the pen had gone through the paper. Then, she stopped thinking about it and looked at the road ahead and decided what needed to happen next. They needed to get Doc Reed to Finch's office. They needed his statement witnessed and documented, and the copies sent to 3 separate locations before Dillard had time to understand what was happening. They needed Thomas to know about the silver, because Thomas making decisions without complete information was a situation that served no one except Dillard, and they needed someone to ride back to the ranch and tell Walt Cannon what they had and how much time they had to use it before Dillard did something with the information Pete Garner had ridden south with in the night. One thing at a time. Her father had said this in the context of emergency medicine, and she had applied it to everything since, because it turned out to be the most reliable principle available for any situation where multiple things were simultaneously wrong. One thing at a time. And the first thing was getting Doc Reed's testimony into the legal record before anyone had a chance to make it impossible. They rode into Red Rock under the mid-morning sun with the cold at their backs, and the main street mostly occupied by people conducting their ordinary Tuesday, and not one of them had any reason yet to understand that the shape of the next several days had just changed in the relay station on the old freight road. Grant Dillard's bank building stood at the center of the street, with the proportional confidence of a structure that had been built to communicate permanence. She looked at it as she passed. Patient man. 3 years of patience. A trap built so carefully that dismantling it required a specific kind of counterpatience. The willingness to move through it methodically rather than in the direction of the obvious and immediate. She was her father's daughter. She knew how to be methodical. She knew how to see the thing that needed doing and move toward it without asking permission first. One thing at a time. Doc Reed's statement was the first thing. Everything else was tomorrow. Finch spent 40 minutes taking Doc Reed's statement, and he did it with the methodical patience of a man who understood that the value of the document he was producing was directly proportional to its precision. Every detail placed correctly, every date confirmed, every name spelled in full. Doc Reed sat in the client chair across from Finch's desk, with a blanket around his shoulders that Finch had produced from a cabinet without comment. And he spoke in the clear, unhurried voice of a man who had been rehearsing this particular testimony in the back of his mind for 8 years, and was finally releasing it into a form that could exist independently of him. Rose sat in the corner and did not interrupt. She watched Doc Reed's face while he spoke, and she watched Finch's pen moving, and she thought about the 3 copies they had agreed on. One to the office of the territorial judge in Cheyenne, sent by the afternoon post rider, who left Red Rock at 2 o'clock. One to a lawyer in Laramie, whose name Finch had written on a card and handed to her, without explanation beyond the statement that this particular lawyer had reasons of his own to want Grant Dillard's activities brought to legal conclusion. And one copy that Finch would hold in his office in a location he declined to specify, except to say that if anything happened to him, it would be found. The 2 men from the relay station were in the outer office. Finch had secured their cooperation through a combination of the legal document, the personal firearm he'd had on him, and a frank assessment of what cooperation would mean for their circumstances versus what non-cooperation would mean. They had chosen cooperation with the relieved speed of men who had been looking for permission to make the easier choice. Finch had taken their statements separately and efficiently before Rose and Doc Reed arrived back, which told her something about how quickly he could move when moving was warranted. When the statement was complete, Finch read it back in full. Doc Reed listened without correction until the final paragraph, at which point he stopped Finch with one raised hand and added 4 sentences that Finch wrote exactly as given. Rose did not hear the content of those 4 sentences, because Doc Reed had turned toward the window when he said them, and his voice had dropped below the level the room carried to the corner. But she saw Finch's expression when he wrote them, and she understood from that expression that whatever those 4 sentences contained was the part Doc Reed had been the most afraid to say. Finch sealed the Cheyenne copy and gave it to his assistant, a young man of about 20, who moved with the focused efficiency of someone trained by a precise employer. The assistant left at a near run. The Laramie copy was addressed and sealed and set aside for the 2 o'clock rider. The office copy went into the cabinet that Finch locked, with a key he put in his coat pocket rather than the desk. Then Finch looked at Rose across the room. He'll know by tonight that we have this. He already knows something has changed. The men from the relay station didn't return when expected. She stood. We have hours, not days. What do you need from me? She considered. I need you in Red Rock tomorrow morning when we go to the bank. Finch held her gaze. You're going to the bank. Thomas is going to the bank. I'm going with him. She picked up her bag. You're going to have the inspection document and the territorial court notification. And whatever else you standing to be present at a conversation between a landowner and a banker. That is going to become a matter of public record before it concludes. Finch was quiet for a moment in the way of a man running calculations. That assumes Thomas Harding is capable of being in Red Rock tomorrow morning. It assumes he decides to be, which is a different thing. She moved toward the door. Can you be there? Yes, said without elaboration. The answer of a man who had been waiting for a yes to mean something. She took Doc Reed back to Harding Ranch on the freight road and the long way around, so they came in from the north rather than through Red Rock, where Dillard's eyes ran on the street like water finding low ground. The afternoon was cold and fully committed, and the horses moved well through it. Doc Reed rode beside her and did not speak for the first several miles, which she interpreted correctly as a man preparing himself for a conversation that would require everything he had. She didn't press him. She let the road and the cold and the movement of the horses be sufficient company. It was Doc Reed who broke the silence, and when he did, it was not about Margaret. Tell me how you ended up on a coach to Wyoming Territory. Not intrusive. The question of a man who was curious about the world and had not lost the habit despite the night he'd just spent on a cold floor. Philadelphia had run out of reasons to stay in. She kept her eyes on the road. My father died. The practice closed. The apartment had been borrowed against for the last year of his illness. There was nothing left to settle. And Thomas's advertisement. Thomas's letter. She was precise about this without meaning to be emphatic. He wrote 3 letters. Most men who place those advertisements write one. 1 letter tells you they want something filled. 3 letters tell you they have things to say and not enough people to say them to. Doc Reed considered this for what felt like a genuine amount of time. He's been alone in a way that goes past the ordinary since Margaret. I understand that. He doesn't talk about her. No. She watched the cottonwood stand coming up on the right, which meant the fork was ahead and the ranch was close. But he has a way of making reference to her without meaning to. When something he sees reminds him of how she would have responded to it. The response shows up on his face before he can manage it. Doc Reed looked at her. She could feel the quality of his attention without turning to meet it. You've known him 36 hours, I know. She took the left branch at the fork. My father said once that the most important diagnostic tool was the willingness to be present with the patient long enough for the truth to surface. He said most people got impatient and started guessing before the truth had time to arrive. Edmund Calloway. Doc Reed said the name quietly. He sounds like a man I would have liked. Most people did like him. The ranch was visible ahead, the main house showing lamplight in 2 windows already against the early dark. He made terrible financial decisions, and he was right about almost everything that mattered, and he died too young because of both of those things simultaneously. Walt Cannon met them at the gate. He looked at Doc Reed with the expression of a man who had been managing his relief for several hours, and was now allowing it to arrive. He took the bay's bridle and looked at Rose with something that was not quite gratitude, and not quite apology, and was probably both. He's been up. Walt said it with the tone of someone reporting an outcome he had attempted to prevent. She handed the roan's reins over. How far up? Kitchen. He made it to the kitchen, and then I made the argument about 6 weeks, and he sat down. Good. She looked toward the house. Get Doc Reed something warm and something to eat. He needs an hour before anything else. She looked at Doc Reed. 1 hour. Then you and Thomas are going to have a conversation that should have happened a long time ago, and I'm going to be somewhere else while it does. Doc Reed looked at her steadily. You're giving us privacy. I'm giving him privacy. She was already walking toward the house. He's going to need it. Thomas was at the kitchen table. He had made it there from the bedroom, on the evidence of the careful way he was managing his weight in the chair. Keeping the left side elevated slightly, keeping the ribcage from doing anything that required explanation. He had his hands flat on the table, and he was looking at the door when she came through it, which meant he had heard her coming, and had decided to look at the door rather than pretend he hadn't. His eyes moved over her with the quick, comprehensive assessment of someone checking for damage before anything else. You're not hurt. Not a question. The statement of a conclusion he had reached before she came through the door and was confirming against the evidence. I'm not hurt. She set her bag on the counter and turned to face him. Doc Reed is outside. He's cold and dehydrated, but he's intact. Finch has his testimony in 3 copies with the first one already on its way to Cheyenne. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, the gray eyes with that quality of presence that didn't negotiate itself. The relay station. Yes, you went to the relay station. There were 2 men there. Neither of them was particularly committed to the arrangement. She pulled the other chair out and sat. The Derringer helped clarify the situation. Something moved across his face. It traveled from somewhere that looked like anger through somewhere that didn't have a clean name, and arrived at a place that was quieter and harder to read. I could have been a lot of things. She held his gaze. I wasn't, and Doc Reed is outside. She paused, and Finch has 4 years of documentation plus an eyewitness testimony signed and witnessed this afternoon. Which means tomorrow morning when we walk into Dillard's bank, we are not walking in with our hands empty. Thomas was quiet. His hands on the table had not moved. He said it the way you said a word you were testing the weight of. Yes. She let that sit where it landed. Did you think I came to Wyoming to keep house? The thing that moved across his face this time was different from the other things. She watched it happen and didn't look away from it, and after a moment he didn't look away from it either. No. His voice had dropped to that register she was beginning to recognize as the one where the performed version of him was absent, and what was left was the actual man. I didn't think that. Walt brought Doc Reed in 20 minutes later, fed and somewhat restored, and Rose stood and picked up her bag. I'm going to check the East Fence Line reports with Walt. She said it to the room generally, and not to anyone in particular, which was a form of address she had learned from her father, who used it when he needed to give people space, without making the giving of space into an announcement. I'll be back in an hour. She went out with Walt and the door closed behind them. Walt looked at her in the cold and the dark. East Fence Line reports. I assume you have them. I do, then show them to me. She walked toward the bar and I meant what I said, an hour. The East treat them with kindness. The East Fence Line reports were comprehensive, and she read them with genuine attention because the information in them was relevant to understanding the pattern of what Dillard had been doing to the perimeter of the ranch and over the preceding months. 3 cuts on the south section she already knew about. 2 incidents on the east line that had been attributed to weather, and now, with the rest of the picture assembled, clearly weren't. A section of the North Water diversion that had been blocked twice in the same location. Patient work. Methodical. The kind of perimeter pressure that was designed not to cause immediate crisis, but to accumulate into a picture of a property becoming unmanageable. She understood the strategy now in its full shape. Dillard hadn't been trying to force a quick sale. He'd been building a record of problems, a documentation of difficulty, so that when he finally moved legally and the property's value was assessed by a court, the assessment would reflect managed decline rather than what the ranch actually was. It was a financial argument made in the language of fence posts and diverted water, and it had been running for 3 years. She thought about this while Walt walked her along the east line with a lamp. She thought about silver under the ground that Thomas had been standing on for 20 years without knowing. She thought about the specific cruelty of a plan that used a man's own land against him, by accumulating evidence of its deterioration, while the man who had built it was occupied with everything the building required. Then she stopped thinking about Dillard and started thinking about tomorrow. Tomorrow required a specific sequence. Finch at the bank with the legal documents. Walt's 6 most reliable men positioned at points in Red Rock that gave them presence without announcing purpose. Thomas walking into First Territorial Bank at 10 in the morning, in a condition that was not what Dillard would be expecting, given that his last information was a man under a rockslide, and Rose beside him, because the one advantage they had that Dillard could not have planned for was that he did not know she existed as a variable in this equation. She had been in Red Rock twice. She was not in Dillard's calculations. She was not connected in his understanding to the relay station or to Finch or to the testimony now traveling toward Cheyenne. She was a woman from Philadelphia who had arrived on a coach and gone to a ranch, and for all Dillard knew she was still there. She intended to arrive at the bank as that, and leave as something else entirely. When she came back to the house, the kitchen was empty. She stood in the doorway for a moment and registered the quality of the silence in the place, and understood from it that the conversation she had given space for was still happening somewhere in the house. She made coffee. She sat at the table and drank it, and looked at the dark window, and thought about her father's hands moving over a patient with that quality of certain and unhurried attention that she had tried to replicate every time she'd had her own hands on someone who needed them. She thought about what it cost a person to carry something that belonged to someone else. Doc Reed had carried the knowledge of Margaret's last months for 8 years, and the weight of it had bent him in ways that were visible if you knew where to look. A slight over-carefulness in how he spoke about the past, a quality of held breath around certain subjects. She recognized it because she had seen the same thing in men who carried patients they'd lost, who carried decisions made in the field that came out wrong, who carried the particular weight of the things they knew and had not said. The house settled around her with its night sounds. The wind found the eaves and worked on them steadily. The stove ticked as the metal cooled in intervals. The door at the end of the hall opened. Doc Reed came into the kitchen first. He looked like a man who had put something down after a long time carrying it, and who was still adjusting to the way he stood without it. He looked at Rose with those physician's eyes and nodded once. She nodded back. She poured him a cup of coffee and didn't say anything else. Thomas came in behind him, and he looked like a man who had been taken apart and put back together, not damaged, not diminished, but rearranged. Something that had been structural in his face, some architectural decision he'd been making unconsciously for 8 years, was different. Like a wall that had been load-bearing and turned out, when removed, to have been holding the weight of something that needed to fall. He sat down across from her, looked at the table, then looked at her. She chose not to send for me. His voice was level and direct and had the quality of something said for the first time to a person, rather than rehearsed to the inside of his own skull. She decided I needed to finish what I started, and she decided it without telling me. And by the time it was done, she was gone. Rose held the coffee cup in both hands. Yes. I've spent 8 years believing I chose something over her. He looked at his hands flat on the table. She didn't give me the choice. She made it for me because she thought she knew what I needed better than I did. He paused. She was wrong about the timing and she was right about me, and I don't know what to do with both of those things being true simultaneously. Rose looked at him. You do what you do with everything that's both things at once. You carry it differently than you carried it before. She set down her cup. Before you were carrying it as evidence of something you did wrong. Now you're carrying it as evidence of who she was. That's not lighter, but it's truer. Thomas was quiet for a long time. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind had shifted to the northwest and was coming in with more intention. Doc said you went into that relay station alone. Finch was outside. Finch is a notary. He was armed. She held Thomas's gaze, and I wasn't alone. I had 2 men inside who had already decided the job wasn't worth the complications. They just needed someone to make that conclusion available to them. Something that had been tight in Thomas's face shifted by a degree she felt rather than saw. You made the conclusion available. It seemed like the efficient approach. He looked at her with those gray eyes for a long moment that had things moving through it she was only partially able to identify, and made no attempt to catalog in real time. Tomorrow. He said it like a decision being made rather than a question being asked. Tomorrow. 10 o'clock. Finch will be there with documentation. Walt's men will be on the street. She looked at him. Can you ride? Yes. Your ribs? I'll manage my ribs. He said it without heat, but with a finality she recognized as the place where his limits were set and negotiation did not apply. She looked at him for a moment. Dillard doesn't know about me. What do you mean? In his accounting of this situation, I am the woman who arrived on a coach and went to a ranch. He doesn't know what I've done in the last 18 hours. He doesn't know I found Finch or Doc Reed or what the relay station produced. She kept her eyes steady on his. He's going to walk into that bank tomorrow morning, expecting a damaged man with reduced options and a property with documented problems and a physician who is unavailable to testify. He's going to have a plan built on those conditions. She paused. None of those conditions still exist, and I would like, if it's possible, for him to figure that out after he's already said the things he intends to say, in front of witnesses. Thomas looked at her steadily. You want him to make his play in public before he understands the situation has changed. A man who has been patient for 3 years is going to come to that meeting with his argument prepared and his confidence intact. He's not going to improvise. He's going to do what he planned to do. She picked up her coffee cup. And then Finch is going to be there with legal standing, and Doc Reed's testimony and 4 years of documentation. And the people of Red Rock who do their banking at First Territorial and their business on that main street are going to hear all of it at once. Walt had come in at some point during this and was standing near the door in the way of a man deciding whether to enter or wait. He entered. Pete Garner came back. He said it the way he'd said Pete's name the previous night, like setting something down carefully. Rode in late afternoon. He's in the bunkhouse. Thomas didn't move. His hands stayed flat on the table. He told me what he gave them. Walt's voice was even. It wasn't much. Your general schedule, the route to the canyon. He didn't know what they were planning to do with it. He paused. He knows now. Thomas looked at the table, then at Walt. Is he going to stay? He's asking that question himself. I think the answer depends on what you say to him. Rose stood and took her cup to the dry sink and looked out the window at the dark where nothing was visible. She was making herself absent from the decision without leaving the room, which was a skill she'd learned from her father, who understood that some decisions needed witnesses to be made responsibly but not participants. Thomas stood. The movement cost him and he managed the cost without comment. He looked at Walt. I'll go talk to him. He went out through the back. The door closed. Doc Reed looked at Rose across the kitchen. He's going to let the man stay. Yes. She turned from the window. How do you know? Because Thomas Harding built this ranch on the understanding that the people who work land live with consequences and deserve the chance to meet them. She began banking the stove for the night. And because Pete Garner came back, that tells you what kind of man he is under the bad decision. Most men don't come back. Doc Reed was quiet for a moment. Then, you're going to be good for him. She didn't answer that directly. Go sleep, Doc. You've had a harder day than most people manage, and tomorrow requires everyone to be present. He went. She finished the stove and turned down the lamp, and sat at the table in the near dark, and thought about tomorrow in the systematic way her father had taught her to approach things that mattered. Start with what you know. Move to what you can control. Accept what you can't. She knew Finch would be there with the documents. Doc Reed's testimony was in the legal record. The 2 men from the relay station had given statements that implicated Dillard in the kidnapping directly. Walt's men would be positioned. She could control how she entered the bank, what she said and when she said it, the sequence in which the information became available to the people in the room. She could not control what Dillard did when he understood the situation had changed. What a man with resources and patience and a decade of calculated planning decided to do when the plan ran out. She accepted that and moved past it. Thomas came back in after an hour. He sat across from her in the near dark without turning the lamp up, and she let that be what it was. He's staying. Thomas looked at the table. I know. 6 months without pay. That money goes to the families who borrowed from Dillard's bank under terms that weren't what they were told they were. He paused. Finch has the bank's loan records. Some of those terms will need to be examined by someone with legal standing. Finch can do that. That's what 4 years of documentation looks like when it arrives at a purpose. She looked at him. Thomas. He looked at her. Get some sleep. Tomorrow requires you to walk into a room looking like a man who holds every card in the deck. That performance is a great deal easier when it's not actually a performance. Something moved in his face that was closer to the smile-adjacent territory than anything she'd seen yet. Is it going to be a performance? She held his gaze. Not for you. By tomorrow morning you're going to have everything you need to walk into that bank and mean it. She stood. Sleep. She went to the small room Walt had given her, which she had not used the previous night and which was spare and clean in the way of the rest of the house. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window where the dark outside was complete, and the glass gave back only a dim reflection of the room. She thought about Philadelphia. She thought about the empty apartment and the sold furniture, and the train platform, and the particular feeling of leaving a place where everything that had held you there was gone, and you were choosing movement over remaining. She thought about the letter with the crossed-out sentence and the coach, and the canyon, and the man under the rock. She thought about what it meant that when she'd sat in the chair by his bed the previous night, watching a stranger's breathing in the low lamplight, she had felt more useful than she had felt in 3 years. Not necessary, not needed. Useful, which was a different thing. A quieter thing. A thing that didn't require the drama of being wanted but simply the fact of having something to offer that the situation required. She had been her father's daughter her whole life. She had watched him practice medicine in the language of usefulness, and she had watched it cost him everything material, and she had watched him do it anyway. And, when he was gone, she had understood that the inheritance he'd left her wasn't money because there wasn't any. It was the knowledge of what it felt like to be necessary to someone who was out of options. And that knowledge, once you had it, was impossible to be comfortable without. Wyoming had not been a romantic decision. It had been an accurate one. She lay down and closed her eyes and slept quickly, the way her father had taught her to sleep in the gaps between situations that required everything, cleanly and without ceremony and with enough depth to actually restore something. She woke before light, dressed, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window and watched the Wyoming dark develop its first suggestion of direction. Thomas was at the table when she turned around. She had not heard him come in, which meant he had been there before her, or he had learned to move with a quietness that his size made surprising. "You slept." She poured a second cup and set it in front of him. "Some." He wrapped his hands around it the way she'd wrapped her hands around her own. "How bad is it going to be today?" she considered. "Dillard is going to know by this morning that the relay station is empty. He's going to know Pete Garner came back to the ranch. He's going to know that Doc Reed's practice had visitors yesterday afternoon." She sat across from him. "He's been patient for 3 years. Patient men don't panic. They reassess and they move to their next available option. His next available option is the forged documentation filed in the county record 2 territories over, which Doc Reed's testimony directly contradicts. With contemporaneous records from 1858 that Finch has been holding for 4 years. She held his gaze. He's going to walk into that bank today, believing he still has a legal instrument. He doesn't know about Finch's file. He may not know about Doc Reed's testimony yet. He's going to make his play based on what he thinks he has." Thomas was quiet, drinking his coffee. She could see him thinking in the stillness of his hands and the quality of his eyes. "You want him to make it. I want him to say everything he intends to say with the people of Red Rock within earshot of an open door." She set down her cup. "A man who has operated through proxies and legal instruments and patience for 3 years has never had to make his position public. He's going to find that uncomfortable. He's also going to find that what he says in that room is on the record the moment Finch is present." Thomas looked at her with the directness she had learned to read as his version of speaking. "You've thought about this. I thought about it last night. You said you slept. I thought about it before I slept." She stood. "Eat something. We leave at 9. They rode into Red Rock at 9:40 with Walt at the rear, and the cold morning light making everything on the main street look clean and exposed. Walt's men were already there, positioned with the unremarkable naturalness of people conducting their ordinary business. She counted 4 without looking for them, which meant they were well placed. Finch was outside his office when they passed. He fell in behind them without a word or a gesture, simply adjusting his pace to theirs. He had the satchel. She had confirmed as much in one glance. The bank opened its doors at 10. They were at the door at 10 exactly. The interior of First Territorial Bank was built to communicate financial permanence. Dark wood, heavy furniture, the architecture of an institution that expected to be here when everyone else was gone. 2 tellers behind their cages. A clerk at a desk near the back, and behind the door at the far end, which was closed, Grant Dillard's office. The clerk saw Thomas and went pale in a way that was instructive. He recovered and went to the back door and knocked and opened it, and said something in a low voice before standing aside. Dillard came out. He was impeccably presented in the way of a man who used his appearance as an argument. He looked at Thomas. Something ran through his eyes that was not surprise. He was too controlled for genuine surprise, but was the rapid recalculation of a man who had expected a damaged opponent and was receiving something else. He looked at Rose. She could see the assessment happening. Category assignment. Woman, young, from somewhere east, not a variable he had prepared for. He looked at Finch. That one landed differently. His expression did not change, but something behind it did. Thomas. His voice was the voice of a man who had been practicing controlled warmth for so long it had become his native register. "I wasn't certain you'd make it this morning. Thomas's voice when it came was the voice of a man who was not performing anything. I wanted to have this conversation in your bank, Grant, where the people of Red Rock can walk in and out the way they do every morning. Dillard's eyes moved to the door, which was open, to the tellers, who were finding reasons to stay at their stations, to the 2 or 3 customers who had come in behind them and had not moved toward the cages. I think a private conversation. I don't. Thomas's voice was still even, still without performance. You've been conducting your business privately for 3 years. I think it's time it was public. Dillard looked at Rose again. And this is my wife. Thomas said it with the same evenness as everything else. 2 words that were simply true. Rose looked at Dillard steadily. I have some questions, Mr. Dillard, about a geological survey conducted in this basin 18 months ago. The room changed when she said it. Not dramatically. The kind of change that was more accurately described as a removal of something that had been present, the air of controlled confidence that had been Dillard's from the moment he came through his office door. It didn't disappear, it receded. Finch stepped forward and opened his satchel. I have documentation here regarding a survey commissioned under the cover of railroad planning that was filed privately rather than with the relevant parties. He removed the top document and set it on the nearest table with the calm of a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment for exactly the right amount of time. I also have a signed and witnessed statement from Dr. Samuel Reed regarding the 1,858 acquisition of what is now Harding Ranch, dated and notarized yesterday afternoon, which has been forwarded to the territorial judge in Cheyenne. Dillard looked at the document on the table. He did not touch it. The door opened behind them. 2 people coming in on their ordinary banking business, then stopping when they read the room. They did not leave. Dillard looked at Thomas. The controlled warmth had left his voice entirely, and what was left was the actual voice, which was quieter and more deliberate. You don't understand the position you're in. Thomas held his gaze. I'm standing on land I built with my hands. I'm standing on land that contains resources no one told me about because telling me would have made what you're doing impossible. His voice was the same, level, present, not raised, which made it carry further than if it had been. And I'm standing here in your bank, in front of your customers and your employees, which is exactly the position I'm in. Dillard's eyes moved across the room, to Finch, to the documents, to the people at the door who had been followed in by 2 more who had seen something worth pausing for through the open door. The documentation you're referencing is legally contested. By what? Rose said it before Finch could, because she had been waiting for exactly this and the moment had arrived. By a record filed in a county 2 territories away, in a courthouse that burned after you extended a personal loan to the county recorder. That record. She held his gaze without heat, without performance, with the same steadiness her father had used when he was stating a diagnosis. Dr. Reed's records from 1,858 predate anything you've filed by 22 years. He kept them. All of them. He keeps everything. The room was very quiet. Outside, through the open door, the main street of Red Rock was conducting its mourning, and people on the main street could hear what was said through open doors. Dillard looked at Rose for a long moment. She could see the assessment running, the recalculation, the search for the remaining available options. Would you treat them with kindness? She could see the moment when he understood that the options he had walked into this room were no longer present in the form he'd brought them. You'll be hearing from my legal representatives, said to Thomas, said with the last register of controlled certainty he had available. Finch is my legal representative. Thomas looked at the man he'd known for 20 years across a distance that was more than the length of the room. And he's already heard from yours. He has the documentation. So does Cheyenne. He paused. We're done here, Grant. Dillard went back through his office door and closed it. The sound of it closing was not a slam. It was quieter and more final than that. The sound of a door pulled shut by a man who understood that what was outside it was no longer something he could manage. Finch collected his documents from the table, with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had just completed something he'd been working toward for 4 years. He looked at Rose. She gave him the smallest nod she could make legible. The people near the door were talking in low voices that would move into the street, and then along the street and into the saloons, and the general store and the hotel, and by nightfall everyone in Red Rock who had a loan with First Territorial Bank would know that the man behind that closed door had been operating with considerably less solidity than his building suggested. Thomas walked out through the front door, and Rose walked beside him, and Walt fell in behind them, and Finch came last. On the street the cold air came in off the high ground, and the sun was fully committed to the day now, no ambiguity in it. Thomas stood beside his horse and looked at the street for a moment. Rose stood beside him and let the moment be what it was without filling it. The territorial investigation took 6 weeks and produced results that occupied Ned Finch for considerably longer. The forged documentation was traced to its origins. The survey was entered into the public record, and Thomas Harding's ownership of the mineral rights beneath his land was confirmed in terms that generated a letter from 3 separate mining interests, expressing formal enthusiasm. The loan records at First Territorial were examined, and 15 families received terms that reflect what they had actually agreed to, rather than what had been done to the paperwork afterward. 2 of Dillard's proxies entered plea agreements. Dillard himself faced proceedings that Finch described to Rose as extensive, and she chose to trust his assessment on the grounds that extensive was more than sufficient. Pete Garner worked 6 months and stayed. Doc Reed moved his practice to a room that Thomas had a carpenter build onto the south side of the main house, which was a structure that had more room in it than Thomas had needed alone, and was now discovering the uses of its square footage. The carpenter who built the room also repaired the east fence line and replaced the broken rails in the relay station corral, which Thomas had quietly purchased at the tax assessment price from the county, because it sat at a useful position on the north route, and he had plans for it. It was March when the surveying company came to begin the formal assessment of the silver deposit, and the morning they arrived. Rose stood at the kitchen window, watching the wagons come in from the road, and felt the particular quality of stillness that she had learned in the preceding months accompanied something that needed sitting with rather than analyzing. She had been feeling it for 2 weeks. She had the knowledge that her father had given her in the form of observation and study and years of watching what the body said before the person said it, and she had applied that knowledge to herself with the same systematic attention she applied to everything. She knew what she was sitting with. Thomas came into the kitchen and stood beside her looking out the window at the surveyors making their way toward the pasture. He drank his coffee and she drank hers, and the morning went about its business. Those men are going to find numbers that require decisions. She kept her eyes on the window. They are. I have a proposal about some of those numbers. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. A portion of whatever comes out of that ground should go toward medical care for this region. There are families within 30 miles of this ranch who are making the same choices my father made in Philadelphia, choosing between the payment and the treatment, and losing on both ends. She paused. Doc Reed can't cover all of it alone, but with a funded practice and the ability to bring in additional physicians when the need requires, he could cover most of it. Thomas looked at her profile for a moment. That's where you want the money to go. That's where I want some of it to go. You may have other priorities. I don't. He said it without hesitation. I don't have priorities that would outweigh that. She nodded once, looked back out the window. There's something else. She set her cup down on the sill, turned to face him fully. He was already looking at her with those gray eyes that gave their attention without condition. She held his gaze and told him. He was very still for a moment, the stillness of a man receiving information that required a complete reorganization of the next several decades. Then his hands came up, and his right hand cupped the side of her face, with the particular care of someone handling something they understood the value of, and did not want to damage through inattention. She had watched his hands work these months. She knew what they were capable of, and she knew what it cost him to make them that careful. She let him. We'll need to expand the practice faster. His voice was quiet, and had that quality she recognized from the night he'd talked about Margaret, the register below performance where the actual man was. If Doc Reed is going to be covering 2 patients instead of 1, she understood what he meant, and it was so precisely like him, so consistent with every data point she'd accumulated, to make the announcement of something that changed everything into the language of logistics, the language of what needed doing, because that was how he held things that mattered too much for words. She understood that. She spoke the same language. He's going to complain about it. She picked up her cup. He's going to say it's too much work for a man his age. He's going to be there at 7 in the morning and argue with everyone until noon. Yes. Would you treat them with kindness? She looked out the window at the surveyors spreading across the pasture, measuring the ground above the silver deposit with their instruments, making the invisible visible in numbers that would mean different things to different people. He's going to love it. Outside, the Wyoming spring was arriving with the same directness the territory brought to everything. No preamble, no negotiation. The snow was off the lower elevations. The grass was making its preliminary argument for green. The Appaloosa was out in the near pasture, moving in the easy way of an animal that had been well cared for through the winter, and was now reminding itself what its legs were for. Thomas stood beside her and looked at what they had. Not the silver, not the land or the cattle or the fencing that ran east and west as far as the light allowed on any given day. The morning. The kitchen. The sound of Doc Reed already moving around in the new practice room, which started early and ran late, and had the quality of a man who had found his purpose returned to him in full. Rose drank her coffee and thought about her father, who had chosen the right thing over the profitable thing every day for 30 years, and died with nothing, and left her everything that mattered. She thought about the train platform and the empty apartment, and the letter with the crossed-out sentence. She thought, I don't want someone. She thought, I want. She understood now what was underneath the crossing out. Not a declaration of loneliness, which was what she'd assumed. Something more specific than that. The want of a man who had built something and had no one to show it to. The want of someone to be present with, which was different from the want of someone to fill a space. She had arrived in Wyoming with one bag and her father's medical kit and the knowledge of what it felt like to be useful. She had found a man under a rock in a canyon, and done what needed doing, without asking whether it was her place to do it. It turned out that Wyoming was exactly where she was supposed to be, not because she had known that, because she had moved toward what was true rather than what was safe, and the difference between those two things turned out to be, in the end, the only navigation tool that consistently worked. Outside, the spring morning continued at its own pace. Inside, the stove burned steady, and the coffee was strong, and the surveying company was measuring the ground, and Doc Reed was arguing with someone in the practice room at a volume that suggested he was winning, and Thomas Harding's hand found Rose Calloway's hand on the windowsill and held it. Nothing performed about it, nothing announced, just the simple fact of it.